Vivian Bennett placed an old brass key on the conference table and smiled as if she were giving Ellen a favor. At 55, after 29 years of marriage, Ellen Parker Bennett recognized that smile better than she recognized her own. It appeared whenever Vivian wanted cruelty to pass for good manners. Ellen had been allotted $46,500, a 12-year-old Honda, and a mountain house everyone called worthless. Her husband Mark sat 2 chairs away and never once raised his eyes. The divorce attorney Martin Hayes read the property description from a file already crowded with signatures. The parcel was 3 wooded acres off Cedar Trace Road in East Tennessee, with a house that had stood empty for years. County records valued the land and structure at less than $10,000. A prior inspection had marked the building unsafe until someone proved otherwise. Vivian folded her hands over her handbag. "Your grandmother-in-law always cared about that place," she said. Then she added, "We thought you should leave this family with something that has history." Ellen heard the sentence beneath the sentence. Take the ruin and be grateful. Mark's brother Greg looked up from his phone long enough to watch her reaction. Ellen did not give them one. She had spent 19 years as a hospital nurse, and stillness had become one of her professional skills. She could keep her hands steady beside a frightened patient while alarms sounded. She could also keep them steady while a family divided her life into columns. The house they had shared outside Knoxville stayed with Mark after a refinance that had put the mortgage solely in his name. The retirement account was split under the settlement they had negotiated through months of exhausted compromise. The vehicle Ellen received needed tires and carried a dent from a mailbox she had backed into years earlier. None of that surprised her anymore. The key did. She picked it up and felt another small object already resting in her coat pocket. It was a worn silver thimble engraved with 3 letters MRH. Martha Rose Holloway. That had been Martha's name before she married into the Bennett family. Martha had pressed the thimble into Ellen's palm 11 months earlier during their last real conversation. She had also handed Ellen a small envelope and told her not to open it until she truly needed it. At the time, Ellen had assumed the old woman was being sentimental. Then Martha died in July. The marriage collapsed by fall. The envelope disappeared into a shoebox beneath Ellen's bed while attorneys, bank statements, and sleepless nights took over everything else. Now Vivian was offering her another key to a house no one in the family seemed to want. Hayes slid the final signature page toward Ellen. She signed. Mark signed after her. Vivian stood before the ink was dry. Greg followed her into the hall. Mark remained seated long enough to put his pen down, but not long enough to say goodbye. When they were gone, Hayes asked Ellen whether she needed anything else. She almost said my name back. Instead, she shook her head. Her maiden name was Parker, and she had not yet decided whether returning to it would feel like recovery or erasure. She sat alone until the office became quiet. Then she tucked Vivian's key beside Martha's thimble and walked out. The drive toward the Smokies took more than 2 hours once Ellen left the highway. She had made most of that route many times, but never for the reason she was making it now. For nearly 10 years, she had driven to Mountain Crest Assisted Living to visit Martha. She usually carried a loaf of cinnamon apple bread from a bakery along the way. Martha would eat 1 slice, save the rest, and forget it by the time Ellen returned the next month. Ellen would throw away the old loaf, bring a new one, and never mention the waste. No one had assigned her those visits. They began in 2015 after the Bennett family moved Martha out of the mountain house at 94. Mark had mentioned over dinner that somebody ought to check on his grandmother once she settled in. Ellen drove up that Saturday. Martha had been tiny, sharp-eyed, and suspicious of comfort. She studied Ellen for half a minute before pointing to the chair. "You came this far," she said. "You might as well sit." Then she came again the next month, and the month after that. Vivian visited on holiday. Greg appeared once when paperwork needed a family signature. Mark came occasionally and ran out of conversation almost as soon as he sat down. Ellen brought bread in time. Martha filled that time with stories about the ridge, the old house, and Caleb, the husband she had buried decades earlier. She talked about gardens, storms, neighbors, and the slow betrayal of hands that had once done whatever she asked. She had quilted nearly her entire life. Even after she could no longer control a needle, she spoke about fabric as if color and memory were the same language. More than once, she mentioned a locked room at the end of the hallway in her old house. She never explained what was inside. When Ellen finally asked why the room mattered, Martha said it belongs to the person who kept coming back. Then she asked Ellen whether the bakery had changed its recipe. In March, 4 months before Martha died, the apple bread stayed unopened on the bedside table. Martha looked tired in a way Ellen recognized immediately, not dying that day, but moving towards something. After 20 minutes of ordinary conversation, Martha opened the drawer beside her bed. She took out the silver thimble first. "Those are my first initials," she said, tracing MRH with a fingertip. Then she handed Ellen the envelope. Inside, Ellen briefly saw a narrow key and a card with an attorney's name. Martha closed Ellen's fingers around the envelope before Ellen could ask anything. "Not yet," she said. "When will I know?" "When you stop thinking you can wait for somebody else to decide what happens to you." Ellen had laughed softly because the words sounded too dramatic for the room they were in. Martha did not laugh. Ellen put the envelope away. By summer, Martha was gone. By autumn, Mark was coming home at irregular hours and answering ordinary questions like they were accusations. The divorce papers arrived before Ellen had figured out which fight they were supposed to settle. The Bennett family handled conflict the way some families handled heirloom china, carefully, privately, and always behind a closed door. No one screamed. No one explained more than necessary. Decisions appeared fully formed, and Ellen was expected to adjust. For years she had. On that February afternoon, Cedar Trace Road narrowed until the pavement became gravel. Her phone lost service near the last mailbox. The woods crowded both sides of the road. Bare branches scraped the roof of the Honda. Then the trees opened and Ellen saw the house. It sat low against the ridge, weather-darkened and quiet. One corner of the porch had dropped several inches. Vines covered part of the eastern wall. The windows were clouded with dust, but the roofline was straight. The stone chimney stood solid. The place looked neglected, not defeated. Ellen shut off the engine and listened. Wind moved high in the trees. Nothing else did. The brass key Vivian had given her turned easily in the front door. That surprised Ellen more than it should have. She expected swollen wood rust resistance. Instead, the lock released and the door opened inward. The first smell was cedar. Not damp plastic, not milk, cedar. Someone had left blocks of it in drawers and closets before the house was closed. The front room held wide plank floors, a stone fireplace, and dust, so even it looked almost deliberate. A single strand of rust-red yarn hung from an iron hook above the mantel. The kitchen still had 4 wooden chairs and a heavy cast-iron skillet on the stove. The skillet's handle faced the wall. Ellen's mother had kept hers that way to prevent children from grabbing it. Small habits survived people. She found one bedroom at the rear of the house. Above the bed hung a small quilt, protected from the wall by a wooden dowel. It showed a cabin on a slope, an apple tree, and a stone chimney. In the lower corner, tiny stitched letters read, 1947. Martha Rose Holloway, age 26. Ellen stared until the fading winter light forced her to move. 3 doors lined the hallway. The bathroom was first. A linen closet came next. At the very end stood a darker, heavier door with newer hinges and a separate lock. Ellen tried Vivian's key. It entered halfway and stopped. She turned it once, then again. Nothing. The key had never belonged to that lock. Ellen crouched and examined the narrow keyway. Martha had not simply locked the room. She had given it its own door hardware. Ellen sat on the hallway floor with her back against the wall. Her phone showed 1 weak bar. For the first time in months, she thought about the shoebox under her bed in Knoxville. Her neighbor Pam Reese still had an emergency key to the house. Pam answered on the 4th ring. "I need you to do something strange," Ellen said. "That narrows nothing down with you lately." Despite herself, Ellen smiled. She told Pam where to find the shoebox. A minute later, cardboard scraped against the phone. "There's a little key in here," Pam said, "and a business card. Read it. Henry Sloan, attorney at law office in Briar Glen." Ellen looked at the locked door. "Can you send the envelope to me overnight?" Pam did not ask. That was one reason Ellen trusted her. After the call, Ellen remained on the floor until the light failed. She had brought an air mattress and a blanket in the trunk. There was electricity in part of the house once she reset the main breaker, but no heat except the fireplace. She built a small fire and slept in the front room wearing 2 sweaters. Before closing her eyes, she touched the thimble in her pocket. Martha's words no longer sounded dramatic. They sounded timed. The next morning, Ellen drove into Briar Glen. Henry Sloan's office occupied the 2nd floor above a shoe repair shop and a small cafe. He was in his early 70s, with white hair and reading glasses hanging from a cord. When Ellen gave her name, his expression changed from polite to expected. "I wondered when you'd make it here," he said. He led her into an office crowded with old file boxes. Then he took a thick folder from a locked cabinet. "Martha Bennett first came to me in September of 2014, he said. She was 93 and still driving herself. Sloan almost smiled. "I tried to convince her to let somebody bring her home. She told me that was none of my business. That sounded exactly like Martha. Sloane placed a 4-page will on the desk. Ellen read the beneficiary paragraph twice. The property on Cedar Trace Road, including the house and all contents, had been left directly to Ellen, not to the Bennett family, to Ellen. The will had been signed more than a decade earlier. Sloane removed a note card from the folder. "I wrote this down after she left," he said. "She told me she wanted the work to go to the person who had given her time, not the relatives who only came when signatures were needed." Ellen looked at the card without touching it. Martha had drafted the will before Ellen had even understood how much the visits meant. Sloane continued. After Martha died, Vivian had challenged the will, claiming Martha lacked capacity when she signed it. The probate case had taken several months. Medical records and witnesses supported Martha's competence. The court rejected the challenge in November. Sloane had mailed the final probate notice to Ellen's marital address by certified mail. He slid the return receipt across the desk. The signature belonged to Mark. Ellen knew the shape of his capital M. She had watched him write it on tax returns, birthday cards, school forms for nieces and nephews, and finally their divorce papers. The delivery date was December 3rd. Ellen felt her mind become very quiet. The financial disclosures for the divorce had been exchanged after that. Cedar Trace Road did not appear on them as property already owned by Ellen. Instead, the settlement described the house as an old Bennett family asset Mark was conceding to her. That fiction had mattered during negotiation. Ellen had accepted less elsewhere because the land was presented as part of what she was receiving. "Can they do that?" she asked. Sloane did not give her a speech. He said, "Your divorce lawyer needs to see this." He explained that a settlement reached through a material misrepresentation could sometimes be reopened. The exact remedy would be for the court to decide. What mattered now was preserving the documents and not making any private deal with the Bennett family. Ellen folded her hands. For once, she did not feel rushed by someone else's timetable. "Not today," she said. Sloane nodded. "Today I want to know what Martha locked away." Sloane opened a desk drawer. Inside lay a thin with a round tip. "Martha left this with me the day she signed the will." He placed it on the desk. "She said the person who needed it would understand what it was for." Ellen drove back to Cedar Trace Road with the will, the certified mail receipt, and the narrow key in her coat. The hallway seemed shorter when she returned. The key slipped into the lock without resistance. One turn released it. The door opened. A stronger wave of cedar air moved past her. The room had no windows. 3 walls were lined with shelves built from floor to ceiling. Every shelf held muslin-wrapped bundles tied with cotton tape. Each bundle had a small handwritten label. Ellen stood in the center and began counting. She lost her place twice. The third time, she touched each bundle lightly with one finger. 127. The number made the room feel larger. She opened the first bundle. Its label read before the cut-through, MRH 1947. Inside was a square textile panel showing the same mountain house she had seen in the bedroom, but this version held more of the world. A vegetable garden ran beside the house. Laundry moved on a line. A dog rested beneath the porch. At the far edge, a road crew pushed earth through the trees. The road looked small in the image, almost harmless. Ellen understood what Martha had done. She had stitched change into the same frame as the life it would alter. The next bundle showed women at a church fundraiser in the early 1960s. There were faces, hands, jars, paper sacks, and a cigar box being used to collect money. Nobody posed. Every figure was occupied with work. The third bundle Ellen opened stopped her. The label read VB 1974. The quilt showed a young woman standing at the front door of a suburban house. She carried a toddler on one hip. Her other hand gripped the doorknob. Her mouth was smiling. Her eyes were not. Ellen recognized the door. For 26 years, she had eaten Thanksgiving dinner behind it. It was Vivian Bennett's house. The woman in the quilt was Vivian. Martha had captured her at maybe 25 years old, young enough to be uncertain and determined enough to hide it. Ellen had worn the same expression at her first Bennett Thanksgiving. She remembered arriving with a homemade pie and silently counting every possible criticism before the door opened. The quilt did not make Ellen feel triumphant. It made her feel seen by someone who was no longer alive. She wrapped the piece again and returned it to the shelf. Then she took Martha's thimble from her pocket. For a moment she considered placing it in the empty corner of the bottom shelf. Instead, she kept it in her hand. She was not ready to leave it behind. Ellen slept in the house again that night. The next morning she drove a mile down a narrower road to visit Della Calloway. Pam had not sent her there. Henry Sloane had. Della opened the door before Ellen finished knocking. She was 70 broad through the shoulders, with gray hair clipped at the nape of her neck. A quilting frame hung on the wall behind her. A half-finished star pattern stretched across it. "You're Ellen," Della said. It was not a question. She turned toward the kitchen. Coffee first. Della had known Martha for nearly 50 years. She began learning from her in 1978, when Della was 22 and newly married. Martha had never taught with lectures. She worked beside people. If Della made a bad stitch, Martha quietly removed it, handed the needle back, and waited. Eventually, Della learned to notice the mistake before Martha did. Ellen told her about the locked room. She described the shelves, the bundles, the labels, and the count. Della listened without interrupting. When Ellen mentioned the 1974 quilt of Vivian at the doorway, Della set down her mug. "That sounds like Martha," she said. She noticed what people tried hardest to hide. "Did you know about the room?" "I knew there was a room." Della had asked once, years earlier, what Martha kept there. Martha told her only that the collection was waiting for the person who would treat it as memory instead of clutter. Della never asked again. For years before Martha entered assisted living, Della brought groceries and prescriptions every Thursday. A church deacon checked the well pump and wiring once a month. Neighbors cleared branches after storms. She didn't live alone in the way the family tells it, Della said. She lived without them. The difference hurt more than Ellen expected. Della told her what happened in 2015 when Vivian and Greg came to move Martha into assisted living. They walked through the front room and saw several quilts Martha still kept on display. Vivian called them old fabric and said somebody should donate whatever was usable. Martha was 94 and using a walker. She blocked the doorway. Nothing left the house. Vivian finally said nobody wanted the things anyway. The following week, Martha asked Della for the name of a locksmith. Della gave her one. "That was when she changed the lock," Ellen said. Della nodded. She wanted a door nobody could open by accident. Ellen looked toward the half-finished quilt on Della's wall. Why keep all of it hidden? Della thought about the question. Martha made things for people her whole life, she said. Maybe this was the first time she got to decide who would receive the whole of her work. By noon, Ellen understood that the room contained more than family keepsakes. She also understood she was not qualified to decide what it was worth. Henry Sloan gave her the name of Dr. Marisol Kent, an independent textile historian who worked with regional museums and university archives. Kent arrived 2 days later carrying a camera, cotton gloves, a laptop, and a folder thick with photocopies. She stopped at the quilt room threshold. For several minutes, she read labels without entering. Then she turned to Ellen. "How many pieces?" 127. Kent looked back at the shelves. "I've been looking for evidence of this collection for almost a decade." Della arrived before lunch with a thermos and took a chair in the hallway. She watched Kent work with the silent suspicion of someone protecting a friend's kitchen from an inspector. Kent photographed each wrapped bundle before opening it. She recorded dimensions, stitching, fabric, dates, inscriptions. She never stacked one textile directly on another. When she opened before the cut-through, she stopped taking notes. She pulled a photocopy from her folder. It showed a blurred black-and-white image of the same work. A regional folk art survey documented this in 1989 from a photograph, Kent said. The original location was recorded as unknown. She compared the road crew in the copy with the stitching in front of her. The researcher noticed this detail. Della leaned forward from the doorway. "The road is the thing that changed the house." Kent nodded, and Martha put both moments together. The hours passed slowly. By early afternoon, Kent reached 3 larger bundles, set apart at the end of the lowest shelf. The first contained no traditional quilt pattern. It was a broad linen panel filled edge to edge with scenes and stitched writing. Dates, names, gestures, rooms, weather, meals, arguments, births, absences, and work all existed in thread. Kent lowered her magnifier. "This is narrative textile," she said. She made a diary without paper. The second and third bundles were the same format. Together, the 3 panels covered decades. Kent said she had encountered only a handful of comparable works in public collections. She could not responsibly place a value on the diary panels that day. The standalone quilts were easier. After reviewing the full room, she gave Ellen a preliminary range approaching $1 million, with the possibility of considerably more if the collection remained intact. Ellen stared at her. Kent raised one hand. "That is not an offer." "I know. It also assumes documented authorship, condition reports, and a buyer or institution willing to preserve the group." Ellen nodded. Kent continued carefully. "If you scatter it, you may make money faster and lose the reason the collection matters." That sentence settled the decision before Ellen knew she had made it. She looked through the kitchen doorway toward the closed room. I'm not breaking it up. Della's shoulders eased. Kent closed her notebook. Then before we discuss institutions, you need to read the 3 diary panels. That evening, Ellen spread the linen panels across clean sheets in the front room. She sat on the floor beneath a lamp and began with the earliest one. Martha had stitched her childhood in the same mountain hollow where the house still stood. There was the apple tree, a one-room school, a narrow church, and a father splitting wood. Then came Caleb Bennett. He appeared first at the edge of a church supper, and later beside Martha at the same kitchen table Ellen had used that morning. Martha's mother-in-law occupied several early scenes. The stitched notes beneath them were unsentimental. The woman taught Martha how to preserve tomatoes. She also corrected her in front of other people. Years later, Martha recorded that age had made the woman gentler. There was no grand forgiveness in the thread, only change observed over time. Ellen moved to the second panel. Vivian entered the record as a young wife beside Martha's oldest son. The earliest notes described a woman who watched a room carefully before acting. Over the years, holiday plans, family schedules, and decisions slowly moved into Vivian's control. Her husband appeared less and less in the center of scenes. Caleb changed too. On the later portion of the panel, Martha stitched him repeatedly on a back step with his hands loose between his knees. Beneath one image, a short line was worked in dark thread. He quit fighting every decision in 1979. Below it, Martha had added another. I knew why, because I had done the same. Ellen read the 2 sentences more than once. Silence had always embarrassed her. She had treated it as evidence of weakness in herself. Martha's record offered a harder explanation. Sometimes silence was not surrender. Sometimes it was a calculation made by people who had spent years learning the cost of being heard. That did not make it healthy. It made it understandable. Ellen thought about the conference room. She thought about all the dinners where Vivian decided and Mark agreed by saying nothing. She thought about the final year of her marriage, when Ellen stopped asking questions because every answer created another evening of cold distance. Martha had lived inside an earlier version of the same pattern, and unlike Ellen, she had documented it. The third panel felt different almost immediately. Caleb was gone. His absence appeared, but it did not dominate everything afterward. Della entered the record. So did garden, changing seasons, church suppers, and the ridge in different light. Martha's world became smaller in miles and wider in attention. Then, years into the panel, Ellen found a small stitched car. A loaf wrapped in paper rested on the passenger seat. The next scene showed a table beside a window with 2 mugs. Beneath it were 5 stitched words. EPB bread came again. Ellen covered her mouth with one hand. Martha had not written a speech about her. She had recorded the repeated act. A car, bread, a chair. Coming back, Ellen remained on the floor long after she stopped reading. Near midnight, she returned to the quilt room. She noticed a smaller bundle tucked beside the empty corner on the bottom shelf. Its label read Unfinished 2017. Inside was a collapsible quilting frame. Half of a quilt remained pinned to it. The completed side showed the house, the hallway, and the dark door at the end. Martha had rendered the cedar walls, the stone fireplace, and the late afternoon light with astonishing precision. The other half was blank. Not damaged, not abandoned, waiting. Ellen carried the frame to the kitchen table. She sat in front of the untouched half until almost 1 in the morning. I don't know how, she said aloud. The house offered no answer. For the first time in months, that did not feel like rejection. 3 days later, Henry Sloan sent copies of the probate documents to Ellen's divorce attorney. Hayes called her the same afternoon. His voice was more serious than she had ever heard it. He confirmed that the settlement had been negotiated on a false premise about Cedar Trace Road. He would ask the court to reopen the financial portion of the divorce judgment. Ellen asked what would happen. I can tell you what we'll argue, Hayes said. I can't promise what a judge will do. She appreciated him for saying that. The law she was learning could return leverage without returning years. On Wednesday, a black F2 fast up the gravel road. Ellen was sitting on the porch with Della. Della heard the engine and set down her coffee. Vivian stepped out first. She wore a navy coat, pressed slacks, and shoes chosen for an office instead of mountain mud. Greg climbed out from the driver's side with his phone already in his hand. They crossed the yard. Ellen stayed seated. Ellen, Vivian said. For a fraction of a second, she had almost used another name. The family version of Ellen. The one that belonged to them. Vivian stopped at the bottom step. We heard you found some of Martha's belongings. I found what was left in my house. Vivian's eyes tightened. The family would like to see it. You can look. Ellen stood. But if you want to discuss ownership, Henry Sloane will be present. We're not here to argue. Good. Ellen opened the front door. The quilt room stood open at the far end of the hallway. Vivian saw it immediately. She walked past the kitchen without looking at anything else. Greg followed and stopped at the threshold. Ellen had hung 3 quilts on the wall for Kent's photography. Before the cut-through hung on the left. The church fundraiser hung on the right. Vivian's 1974 doorway portrait hung between them. Vivian stopped in front of it. The young woman in thread held a toddler and gripped the doorknob. Her stitched smile was controlled. Her stitched eyes were wary. For several seconds nobody spoke. She had no right to make this, Vivian said. Ellen stood behind her. It was her memory. It is a piece of cloth. It is also a record of how she saw you. Vivian turned. You think you know my family because an old woman liked you. Ellen felt the old instinct to soften her answer. She let the instinct pass. I know what she chose to leave me. Vivian looked toward the shelves. 124 bundles remained wrapped. These things belong with the Bennetts. The probate court already decided that. Vivian's mouth became still. Ellen continued. The will was upheld in November. She watched Greg's face. He knew. Certified notice came to my house in December, Ellen said. Mark signed for it. Greg pushed away from the doorframe. We should leave. Vivian turned sharply. Why? Greg put his phone in his pocket. Because our lawyer told me last month what this looks like. Ellen studied him. I knew there had been a probate ruling, Greg said. I didn't know what was in the room. He looked at Vivian. But I knew Ellen owned the property. Vivian stared at him. Greg's expression carried no anger. Only fatigue. He walked out. The front door closed behind him. Vivian stayed in the quilt room. Her eyes returned to the 1974 portrait. She should not have done this, she said, quieter than before. Ellen looked at the young woman in thread. Maybe she knew you would hate being remembered before you had everything under control. Vivian's hand tightened around her purse strap. For the first time, Ellen saw something besides command in her face. It was not remorse. It might have been recognition. Vivian turned away and left without another word. Ellen listened until the SUV disappeared down the road. Della came into the hallway carrying the thermos. She looked at it. She did. Della poured fresh coffee into Ellen's mug. Then Martha would have considered the afternoon productive. Ellen laughed once. It surprised both of them. That Saturday, a familiar Honda appeared around the bend. Ellen knew the dent in the rear bumper before she recognized the driver. Mark sat behind the wheel for nearly 5 minutes. When he finally got out, he wore jeans, a gray pullover, and hiking shoes that had probably never been on a trail. He knocked twice. Ellen opened the door but did not invite him in immediately. I'm not here to fight about the property, he said. What are you here for? I want to see what she made. Ellen looked at him. Then she stepped aside. At the quilt room door, she stopped. Mark entered alone. He moved slowly along the shelves, reading labels. He opened nothing. When he reached the 3 quilts on the wall, he stared at his mother's portrait. The child on Vivian's hip was Greg, barely 2. Mark had not yet been born. He moved to the diary panels Kent had temporarily hung along the far wall. He read the portion about Vivian. He read the entries about Caleb withdrawing from family arguments. He found the line about 1979. Mark's shoulders changed. Not much. Enough for Ellen to notice. Then he reached the 3rd panel. He saw the stitched car, the loaf of bread, the table by the window. EPB bread came again. His hand lifted toward the linen and stopped before touching it. He stood with his back to Ellen. I signed for Sloane's letter, he said. Ellen did not answer. I gave it to Mom. Still Ellen said nothing. She told me she would take care of it. Mark turned slightly. I knew it was about Grandma's estate, but you didn't ask what happened. No. And you signed our disclosure after that. Yes. The answer came without defense. Ellen waited. Mark looked at the floor. I knew there was something I did not want to know. That was closer to the truth than any apology he had offered during the divorce. He moved to the wall where Martha's later years were stitched. Season, the garden, Della's truck, a hospital shuttle, a winter window. He studied the record of a life he had reduced to occasional visits. Then he sat on the floor with his back against the shelving. My mother said Grandma was fine, he said. I wanted that to be enough. Ellen stayed in the doorway. I told myself somebody else was checking. His voice lowered. I guess somebody else was. He looked up at the ceiling. I'm sorry, Grandma. The room remained quiet. Ellen did not step forward to comfort him. Some grief belonged to the person who had earned it. After several minutes, Mark stood. He looked older than he had when he arrived. Not ruined, just less protected from himself. I know I don't get to ask you for anything, he said. No, he nodded. What are you going to do with the collection? Keep it together. Here, for now. Mark looked toward the shelves. I think she'd like that. Ellen almost told him not to speak for Martha. Instead, she let the sentence remain his. He put on his jacket and walked out. The Honda disappeared around the bend. Ellen stood at the front door until the sound was gone. Then she returned to the kitchen. The unfinished frame was still on the table. The white half looked less like emptiness now. It looked like responsibility. By March, Ellen had moved into the house full-time. She did not call it home yet. She called it Cedar Trace. That was enough. The porch needed immediate work. A carpenter named Luis Ortega came up on 3 weekends with lumber in the bed of his truck. Della had sent him. He charged Ellen for materials and refused payment for labor beyond lunch. When she argued, he said, "Take it up with Della." Della, when confronted, said no. That ended the dispute. Ellen stained the new porch boards herself. Under the lowest rail, she found 2 old initials carved into the wood: CB, Caleb Bennett. She worked around them. Inside, the house slowly shifted from preserved space to lived space. Coffee appeared on the counter. Food filled the cabinets. A coat hook by the door became Ellen's. She bought a used mattress from a woman Della knew. The cast-iron skillet returned to the stove. Its handle still faced the wall. The quilt room remained nearly unchanged. Kent insisted on better humidity monitoring, archival boxes for the most fragile pieces, and a written inventory. Ellen agreed to preservation measures that did not alter the room's character. The 3 diary panels stayed on the far wall for study. The thimble stayed in Ellen's coat pocket. She still touched it whenever an attorney called. The legal matter moved slowly. Hayes filed a motion in February. The Bennett family responded in March. A hearing was postponed. Another filing followed. Ellen wrote each update in a notebook by the coffee maker. Hayes told her the evidence was strong. Then he reminded her strong evidence and fast results were not the same thing. Ellen thanked him. For the first time in her adult life, she stopped treating waiting as obedience. She went back to nursing 3 days a week at Foothill Community Clinic. The work was lighter than the hospital floor. She handled medication reviews, patient intake, and follow-up calls. Her back pain eased over the spring. She could not prove the divorce had caused the worst of it. She also could not ignore how much better she slept when nobody came home at midnight and refused to explain why. Kent began arranging conversations with preservation groups and a regional university archive. Ellen made one condition clear: the collection would remain together. She was willing to discuss loans, study access, conservation, and exhibitions. She was not willing to sell individual pieces to private buyers. Money mattered. Ellen had $46,500, part-time income, a legal bill, and a mountain house needing repairs. But money was no longer the only measure in the room. Martha had saved an entire record from becoming household clutter. Ellen would not turn it into inventory by the piece. In early May, Della brought 5 women up the road for a Saturday quilting class. 2 were experienced. 3 had never held a quilting needle properly. Ellen borrowed card tables and folding chairs. She sat with the beginners. Her first stitch pulled the fabric into a pucker. Della walked over, removed the stitch without comment, and handed the needle back. Ellen looked at her. Della's mouth moved at one corner. Martha. Exactly. The class settled into a quiet rhythm. One woman asked about Vivian's portrait. Della did not dramatize the answer. Martha did not sew saints and sinners, she said. She recorded people as she saw them. The woman considered that. Then she returned to her needle. Ellen wrote Della's sentence in the notebook by the coffee maker later that evening. She had started recording small things she did not want to lose. A repair completed. A name connected to a quilt. A phrase Della used. The date Rain first returned after a dry week. She did not call it a diary. She knew better than to rush names. By late May, Ellen began driving Della home after the Saturday classes. Della objected the first 2 times. On the third, she accepted without comment. One evening, Ellen watched her climb the porch steps more slowly than usual. Della gripped the railing longer. "You left a burner on last Tuesday," Ellen said. "It was low." "Low is still on." Della turned. "I'm 71, not 90. I know." The 2 women looked at each other across the fading light. Della's expression changed. "My daughter calls on holidays," she said. "My son sends messages when his wife reminds him." Ellen waited. "Nobody was checking every week before you came up here." Ellen understood what Della was admitting. "You checked on Martha every Thursday for years. That was different." "No," Ellen said. "I don't think it was." Della held her gaze. Then she went inside. Ellen remained in the car until a kitchen light came on. After that, she checked Della's stove, without announcing that she was checking it. Della noticed and pretended not to. By summer, the house had begun to develop a rhythm. Quilters came on Saturdays. Kent returned when documentation required another day with the collection. Luis came when a hinge failed or a porch board shifted. The legal case continued at the slow pace Hayes had warned her about. The Bennett family filed a response. Another hearing date moved. More letters arrived in envelopes thick enough to make Ellen sigh before opening them. She wrote every update in the notebook by the coffee maker. Hayes still believed the evidence was strong. He also kept reminding her that a strong case could remain unresolved for months. Ellen stopped asking him to predict the ending. She asked only what she needed to do next. Most weeks, the answer was nothing. She learned that doing nothing on instruction felt different from being silenced. Kent's preservation conversations also moved slowly. A regional university archive wanted to study the collection. A folk art foundation asked for condition reports. No final agreement had been signed. Ellen kept repeating the same condition. The collection would remain together. She would consider conservation, research access, and future exhibitions. She would not sell the quilts one by one. Money mattered. Ellen had limited savings, part-time income, legal bills, and a mountain house needing repairs. But the room had already taught her that price and value were not the same question. Martha had kept an entire record from becoming household clutter. Ellen would not undo that simply because a buyer could write a check. The unfinished quilt remained on the kitchen table. Ellen still had not touched it. She had learned basic stitching by then. She could keep a straight line. She could choose tension without puckering fabric. But the blank half did not feel like a beginner's exercise. Della never pushed. Neither did Kent. September cooled the nights. The ridge began to show the first red leaves. One morning, Ellen found the silver thimble in the pocket of a coat she had not worn since spring. She held it and realized she had gone several weeks without reaching for it. The discovery frightened her for a second. Then it relieved her. An object could matter without being carried every minute. In October, the mountain changed color almost overnight. Ellen woke before dawn and took coffee to the rebuilt porch. 9 months had passed since the divorce conference. The railing had a lighter patch where her hand rested each morning. Use had begun leaving marks of its own. Inside, the thimble waited on the kitchen table. She had set it there the night before while looking for her keys. For 19 months, she had carried Martha's initials through the divorce, the locked room, the lawyers, and the family confrontations. Now she carried the thimble to the quilt room. The bottom shelf still held a faint, clean circle where she had once considered leaving it. Ellen placed the thimble inside that circle, faced outward. She stood there long enough to feel the absence of its weight from her pocket. Then she walked away. Della arrived at 8 without knocking. She had stopped knocking in July. Ellen had stopped expecting her to. Della set her quilting bag on a chair and put water on for tea. Her movements were slower than they had been in winter. Ellen noticed and did not comment. When the kettle boiled, Della carried 2 mugs toward the quilt room. She stopped at the unfinished frame. The completed half still showed the house and hallway. The blank half still waited. Della placed 1 mug on the bottom shelf beside Martha's thimble. Then she opened her quilting bag. Inside was a small metal tin filled with thread. Bark, stone gray, smoke white, deep cedar, faded apple red. Colors chosen for this house. Ellen looked at her. You planned this. Della threaded a needle. I brought supplies. That is not an answer. It is the answer you're getting. Ellen smiled. Della pulled the wooden chair in front of the frame. She sat. Her fingers found the point where Martha's last stitch ended in 2017. For a moment, Della simply held the needle there. Ellen realized the older woman was giving the silence its due. Then the needle passed through the fabric. It returned. Della made 1 careful stitch, then another. Ellen stayed in the doorway with her coffee. She did not ask what the unfinished half would become. She understood that finishing was not the same as copying. Martha had left room. Della was beginning where Martha's hands had stopped. Ellen would learn beside her. Outside, wind moved through oak, hickory, and sourwood. The repaired porch held. The old stone chimney held. The house, closed for years and dismissed as a burden, held. Ellen listened to the faint pull of thread through fabric. It was a small sound. It did not need to be louder. For most of her marriage, Ellen had mistaken endurance for peace. Vivian had mistaken control for stewardship. Mark had mistaken avoiding conflict for staying out of harm. Martha's quilts did not turn any of them into simple heroes or villains. They preserved the consequences of those choices long enough for someone else to see them clearly. What changed Ellen was not the discovery that the house or collection had value. It was the discovery that attention had value before anyone priced it. A monthly visit had mattered when there was no audience, no contract, and no reward waiting in sight. That does not mean care should be performed in hope of being repaid. It means repeated presence leaves evidence even when families fail to name it. The story also leaves a harder question about silence. Silence can protect a person from exhausting conflict for years. It can also teach controlling people that resistance will not come. Mark's silence protected him from choosing between his mother and his wife until the choice was made without him. Ellen's silence helped her survive rooms where she felt outnumbered, but it also delayed the moment she reclaimed authority over her own life. There is no honest lesson here that says every conflict should become a confrontation. Some arguments are unsafe, pointless, or strategically wrong, but there is a difference between choosing silence and forgetting that you still have a choice. There is also a difference between correcting money and repairing a relationship. The legal settlement mattered because deception had consequences. It did not purchase forgiveness. Mark's apology mattered because he finally named his own avoidance. It did not create a right to return. Vivian's discomfort mattered because she was forced to look at a version of herself she could not manage. It did not prove she had changed. Ellen's new life began when she stopped asking those moments to do more than they could. A door can be opened. A record can be preserved. An account can be corrected. A boundary can be kept. And sometimes the most meaningful inheritance is learning that your time, attention, and choices were real long before anyone else admitted their worth.